Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Duquette, and I'm the founder and a principal at Hexagen Consulting. We are a digital forensic and cybersecurity firm based just out of the Toronto area up in Canada. I'm a longtime digital forensic investigator and ex-law enforcement as well. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Digital Forensics 101 and how digital forensics can be used to protect an organization's data. I recently had a chat with a friend who is fairly senior in a large, well-known software company, and they obviously have some very significant intellectual property, some IP. Someone in that company was being fired for cause, and my friend and some of the other coworkers suspected that he may take or already had taken some intellectual property from that company. You know, given their line of business, this was a bit of a concern. And I mentioned to my friend that digital forensic companies can take a look at an employee's computer or mobile phone to see if they are in fact walking out the door with company data. And that's normally an easier thing to deal with before the person leaves, rather than waiting until they're gone. And then maybe you have to get involved in some sort of civil litigation. This message was taken by my friend to the leadership of the company. And in return, an interesting yet possibly short-sighted message came back. And that message was, we trust our employees not to take company data with them when they leave. So I always say, you know, being fired for cause should not equal trust. You're obviously firing that person for a reason, and maybe the trust factor isn't there. You know, placing trust in your employees is an important factor in not only attracting, but also retaining talented individuals, and for encouraging a positive and collaborative corporate culture. However, you have to verify what those employees are doing before they potentially walk out the door with your company's valued property. And I'm not talking about staplers. President Ronald Reagan, while discussing U.S. relations with the Soviet Union, famously would quote the Russian proverb, trust but verify. And when it comes to retaining valuable intellectual property for your company, organizations would do well to use that same proverb as a mantra. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the background of intellectual property theft and insider theft in particular, and then what can be done with it. So from a background perspective, we're going to talk a little bit about the external threat versus insider threat, what type of data needs protecting, the different sources of IP theft and the causes and the timing of IP theft. And then I'm going to show you some actual examples that we've worked with here at Hexagen. So from an external threat, the range of threat actors are fairly diverse, and the control and threat mitigation landscape is ever growing, as we all know. Knowing what and who to combat, using what tools and methods can be very challenging. For the most part, there are four main groups of these external threat actors. There are hacktivists, there are nation states, there are criminals, and corporate espionage. And for the most part, they usually share one common goal. This is to get to or disrupt your data, your crown jewels for your company. And while their motivations are somewhat different, from an external perspective, they usually have the same hurdles to overcome before they can get to those crown jewels. First, they have to find, weaknesses in your systems and get a foothold into your environment, usually elevating their privileges to get to the good stuff. They may then have to fight past your perimeter security features, such as firewalls and other systems, and bend around network security and threat mitigation tools that are in place. And once they then find those crown jewels, they have to infiltrate that system itself to get access rights to allow for the addition, modification, or deletion activity to take place. So basically, if your security folks are doing their job, even though it's really challenging out there with the changing landscape, it's often challenging or tough for the bad guys to get in. However, it still does happen. We've seen this for years. There are, hackers being arrested and charged. Here's a Canadian example from a few years ago, being sentenced for intellectual property theft. That's a hacker group. And obviously, we do still see a lot of nation states. This is a recent article from just, I believe, last week. We still see nation states going after intellectual property from companies. So the term cyber resilience or cybersecurity is the current evolution of what was IT security. It went from IT security to information security and now cybersecurity. The ownership of cybersecurity has moved from being led and operated by IT within a company, and now it's board ownership. The board is involved and they direct and support these initiatives. The risk has moved from only being sort of operational impacts to more of a reputational compliance and financial impact. The investment for a company has moved from being technical to more of a protective culture. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And the threats have moved from being mainly external to now companies are focusing on the external threat and the internal threat. Basically, things have changed. Organizations are now taking cyber seriously, and we all applaud that. But one of the most common things we hear is that organizations want to stop hackers. And while that's great, we also are encouraging the organizations we work with and talk to that they need to look inside their walls as well. That being said, breaches have become far more frequent and much larger in scale. This is a great information is beautiful is the website. I love going to there and taking a look around at all the breaches. Many of these breaches are due to insider human error. But this is not the insider threat that we're going to talk about today. That is a whole other presentation. That is insiders doing something wrong that allows an external person in. So remember that earlier slide, the external one, where we talked about the bad guys having to navigate their way around all the security controls. Well, if you've got a well-developed security architecture, they need to apply significant effort to get to those crown jewels. And sometimes that level of effort is just not worth it, and they'll move on to their next target, which is great. You've helped secure your company. However, let's take a look at this again from the internal threat. From the internal perspective, unlike those external bad guys who need to demonstrate all sorts of hacking kung fu to get to what they want, you've already equipped the insiders within your company with everything they need. They have a way to bypass firewalls. They have a way to slide by your security solutions and potentially go unnoticed by your threat identification and mitigation tools. Do you know what you've given them for that? A username and a password. You've given your employees the ability to get to those crown jewels in your company. And unlike the bad guys, all your employees have to do is worry about how to get the data out of your company. They don't have to worry about trying to get into it. We see this as well all the time still happening. Again, this is a very recent article from just a few days ago, industrial espionage, keeping an eye on the quiet guy. And we're going to talk about some specific behaviors of internal employees in a little bit. So what needs protecting and how is it at risk? IP of this nature, intellectual property, used to be paper-based. However, as we all know, it's mostly now digital. It's stored electronically and accessed with the many digital devices that we use on a daily basis, our phones, our computers, our networks. Since most investigations that we do focus on establishing if and how somebody did what they are suspected of doing, knowledge of the common methods used to remove data is vital to investigations. So a lot of the information that you're trying to protect is obviously your customer information, your staff information, any business plans you may have, your competitors might want to see that, trade secrets, obviously, operational information, software, and the list goes on. It's whatever is important to your company and to you. Some of the common internal theft vectors, for the most part, that we see on a daily basis. Email is obviously still a big one. The use of personal webmail accounts such as Gmail or Yahoo or others. We still see a lot of portable media use. USBs obviously being the most common. They're very simple to slip into your pocket and walk out with, and they're larger in scale. You can fit a lot of data on a 2 terabyte USB. We see instant messaging programs such as Facebook and LinkedIn being able to share files now. So we see files going through that. Cloud storage, we see employees setting up personal cloud storage such as Dropbox or others. Accessing a secure website, or accessing a work computer via remote session. We've seen TeamViewer set up on computers, and employees remoting in at night and sharing files that way. And then obviously you can get down to a very granular level, and even we've seen employees take pictures of intellectual property on a computer screen with their personal camera or phone. That one's a little bit harder to investigate, obviously, unless you have their personal device to look at. We compiled some data from a number of studies that looked at not only the internal theft factors, but also for businesses that had various cyber incidents. And what we were able to see is that the number of incidents for companies are obviously rising year on year. We see that in the news all the time. The stats that we looked at showed that about 80% of companies had some sort of significant incident last year. 32% had more than 50 incidents. And an incident could be anything from just somebody trying to get in or an attempt to get in. And 49% of all of those incidents relate to intellectual property theft. This is both external and internal threats, but 49%, that's a very high number. So obviously, intellectual property for a company is very valuable to both external parties and internal parties. So it's important that we learn how to keep that. Some of the different sources of internal IP theft. Obviously, your current employees make up the largest amount, about 34%. They have the most access to the information. They have the keys to the castle right now for the most part, and a lot of our employees can go unfettered throughout the whole network to different areas. We've seen companies where the entire network is open to every employee, so there's obviously some concern there. Former employees, obviously, they may still have login credentials for things like webmail, or they may have friends inside the company. We've had cases before where people have been fired from a company and they've still been able to log in. Let's say they were fired on the second day of the month and their webmail credentials weren't canceled until the end of that month. So they had almost a full month where they could still log into their mail and get through to different areas. Contractors are obviously an issue. Current contractors, just like employees, contractors are often given access to a wide amount of information, and sometimes are not as monitored as much as current employees. We don't put as much restrictions on them. And then obviously former contractors, they still may know how to get in, especially if they were, sort of IT contractors where they're working on networks, so they may have passwords or know how to get into the system. Causes of IP theft. So the first one is obviously accidental, and this, can be part of an investigation, but it should be addressed by organizational controls. A friend of mine worked for a large software company that was based in the US, and she worked up here in Canada for a long time. And she was often running out of room on her work-issued laptop and asked her manager if he was okay with her getting a large external drive to save all this information on. He approved it, and she purchased a large drive and downloaded lots of material from the company's server over an entire weekend, put it on that drive with the manager's approval. Fast forward about 2 years, and she actually resigned from the company and moved on to another job. And then about a year after that, she found that hard drive in a box that she had put in her house somewhere. And realizing that she had 2 terabytes almost of company data, she was quite concerned. So she gave me the hard drive, and we just forensically wiped that entire drive. But the story here is that the company authorized her to take that IP, and they never tracked it. Right after the fact, after they left, they never asked her if she had any information. So that was obviously an accidental cause of IP. However, what we're talking about today is more the intentional theft of IP. And that can be anything from financial motivation. Obviously, money is a large one, a role, salary increase, whatnot. Disgruntled employees. We've seen lots of people inside of a company are angry for one reason or another and decide to take things or do things with certain data. And then coercion. That can obviously be an external party is either bribing somebody in the company or threats. We've seen that before as well, where criminal organizations external to a company have threatened somebody in the company to get data. So there's all sorts of intentional causes of IP theft. Over that last slide, I mentioned the three main causes of that. The first two being, disgruntled employees and financial data have similar timings as to when the theft of IP occurs. Most of the timing evolves around an employee either resigning or being terminated. And from what we've seen with obviously a resignation, if somebody's resigning from a company, about 1 month or 2 months prior to giving notice, they will start to gather data. Want to leave, make more money at another job, so they start gathering what they may need for that other job. However, and then they resign or they're terminated. But what we do see as well, that when people stick around for a little while, maybe they are terminated, but they don't leave right away. They're not walked out the door. They may take data after that time as well. It's not as common because I think a lot of people think that after they're terminated or they resign, that the controls or monitoring on their systems will increase. And what we've seen, obviously, sometimes it doesn't. And after they leave, as I mentioned before, some systems are obviously left open, such as webmail. We've seen situations like that as before. So if it's a termination, the suspect might be gathering information prior. They may know they're being terminated or have a feeling. And again, after they leave, the systems can often be left open. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some cases that we've worked on of some of this intellectual property theft and sort of how digital forensics came into it a little bit. So in this first example, we had a C-suite employee who was suspected of some wrongdoings, and he was terminated. And he handed in his devices 2 days after that termination happened. They didn't get those devices on the same day he was terminated. They hired us to do a forensic analysis of those devices. And what we had found is that the hard drive on this system was completely forensically wiped. There was nothing on it, no operating system, nothing. It was done. So very, very challenging to try to then gather any information of those wrongdoings or any intellectual property theft. So we're going to use this example later. We're going to talk about what could have been done instead. Another example, we had a IT employee that was suspected of some wrongdoings. He was suspected of deleting important information from the company's servers and using removable devices, USBs, to take data. He was terminated. And we did a forensic analysis going back about 3 years on devices and on the networks. And we didn't really find any smoking gun, unfortunately. In July of 2015, the FBI launched a campaign to educate businesses and industry leaders about protecting their trade secrets and their intellectual property. It focuses a lot on external threats, which we talked about earlier, and mainly from foreign threat actors engaged in corporate espionage. But it also highlights, as I've shown here on the screen, the need to develop an insider threat program, and we're going to talk about that as well. However, they also highlight some behaviors, specific personal behaviors, to look for when an insider in a company is suspected of stealing company data. So we're going to go back to that second example with that IT employee that went rogue, and I'm going to show you some of these examples that the company saw of that employee that should have maybe been some warning signs. And had our client acted upon their suspicions a little bit earlier, it would have saved them the time, the resources, and the cost, obviously, to launch a full investigation and then to pursue civil litigation. Some of these are digital behaviors, and therefore you may be able to easily look into them on the systems. But others are more sort of personal in nature, and you may need to work with others, in your organization to figure that out. So let's take a look at them. So, without authorization takes proprietary, that should be information home via thumb drives or email. They knew that this person was doing that ahead of time. They had information about that, and he actually said to them that he was taking information home to work at home. They must have allowed that. This person was inappropriately seeking or obtaining proprietary classified information on subjects not related to his work duties. He seemed to always step up and say, I'll help with that, I'll do this, I'll do this. And it was outside of his normal work duties. And because he was the IT person, he was gaining access to that different information. And again, the company knew that this was happening. He had interest in matters outside of the scope of his duties, and particularly those of interest to business competitors. He was interested to see what the company was doing in relation to their competitors, their business plans for the future, whatnot. He was remotely accessing the computer network while on vacation, while on sick leave, and at other odd times. He would go home and he would remote into a system. Now, that's not unnormal. A lot of people will do that. Especially a lot of small businesses will do that. They'll figure, okay, I'm just going to go home. I'm going to keep working from home. But this person was doing it at very weird hours and while on vacation and whatnot. So he was disregarding the company computer policies on installing software and hardware, accessing different websites, unauthorized searches, and downloading confidential information. Again, they knew that he was doing a lot of this ahead of time, and they had warned him once or twice about not doing this sort of information. And again, he was working odd hours without authorization. He was enthusiastic for overtime work, weekend work, and unusual schedules when his activities could be, a little bit easier to conduct. So again, we don't want to discourage employees that want to work, and some employees like to work strange hours. But just if you see some of these behaviors, think about them a little bit. Okay. So let's get to what can be done from a digital forensic perspective. So some of the digital forensic techniques that we use during our digital investigations can also be used to help mitigate this theft of a company's IP before it even happens. So what are the relevant digital forensic techniques? Obviously, we need to identify the information ahead of time. What is the the IP that you're looking to identify? We need to capture any data on those devices or on your network or your systems, or preserve that information. We need to process that information. If there's any deleted content that needs to be reconstituted, that we may need to try to recover, we'll need to do that. Obviously, there's some sort of analysis if you're trying to, look at what a user did behind the keyboard, what was their activity at certain times, or maybe there's more than one person involved. We need to analyze all that data to see what was going on. And then obviously some sort of report at the end of the day. And that can be just within a company. It could be used for termination reasons, or it could be used in civil litigation all the time. So, and this is a full circle. This obviously can keep going. It doesn't end right there. Often in our cases, we've gone to the reporting phase, and it's gone a little bit deeper, and we continue that cycle. The other thing that digital forensics allows us to do is cross-reference different activities of an employee. And cross-referencing these artifacts allows us to quickly compare certain intellectual property with potentially other activity, which may suggest the movement of that IP. If you look on the screen here, we had some PDF files that contain some intellectual property from a company. And if you look at the timeline of that, we can see some Dropbox activity, some USB device activity, some Skype file transfers, sort of at the exact same time frame. So that was a pretty interesting one where everything sort of seemed to line up. And then we did a deeper dive to actually see what was going on at those time frames. Some of the digital forensic tools that we use allow us to look at a user's activity at certain time frames to see what was going on. Two of those behavior indicators that I talked about earlier talked about activity after work, normal work hours, or on weekends, or at other strange times. So you can see in a case here, the screen, there wasn't a lot of activity going on during the day. Maybe you should be questioning your employee as to why not. And then there was lots of activity, from about 4 p.m. onwards. So again, interesting. Why that would be happening. Was the employee remoting in and doing work, or were they staying afterwards when nobody was around and doing some work? So the tools that we use allow us to look at that. It also allows us to compare data over time. I talked about earlier how there's often, somebody will start to take data over time when they're, resign, and then maybe even afterwards. So we can compare that data set if we have multiple data sets and compare them to see the changes over time on those systems. We can compare data from multiple sources. We've had cases before where there was collusion within a company, and being able to take those systems and look for a specific file or files across multiple people's systems may help determine if there were people working together to take company intellectual property. So what can be done? As mentioned in that article by the FBI, businesses should develop an insider threat program. And these programs can incorporate many aspects, from monitoring activity, which we see a lot now in companies, to employee training, which we see as well, and obviously to full investigations, whereas that's what we do. However, there are some things to consider before implementing any sort of insider threat program. Big brother tactics are often not the best methods. We don't want to be, staring over our employees' shoulders all the time and having them, walk on eggshells and think that they're not trusted. Again, we go back to that trust by verify. Companies need to play a certain amount of trust in their employees, but the employees, they know that email and web activity can often be monitored. However, diving deeper into everything they do on their systems may breed an atmosphere of untrust, and we obviously don't want that within our organizations. So some considerations that we need to think about before we may develop a program like this to review the activity of an employee to understand what they've been doing. Obviously, we have to get permission. While a business might suspect foul play, it's important to fully understand what's permissible before anything can happen. Just because a staff member was using a company asset doesn't always translate to an open invitation to review everything that they've been doing. Before there's any sort of internal investigation, there must be obviously appropriate sign-off from management of the company. We always suggest make sure that HR is involved in some way, and keep all communication relative to this matter somewhat separate. You may also have to have legal counsel involved from the outset as well, as these matters can often end up in some sort of civil litigation. Check your company policies. Do your company's policies and procedures focus on what an employee is allowed to do, and more importantly, not to do? Does any content exist which deals with activity monitoring or reviews? Are your employees, and specifically any employees that are in the scope of your investigation, aware of those policies that you have? Has your employee read those policies or gone through any sort of awareness training and signed off on their understanding of those corporate policies? I mentioned before that one case with the IT employee that went rogue, and they actually didn't have a lot of internal policies. So, it's challenging. We've had a few cases where we've been hired to find out halfway through our investigation that the company didn't have an acceptable use policy for their systems. And so, in other words, the employees were never told what they can and cannot do with those systems. And that gets very challenging. We can still obviously do our investigation, but from a civil litigation perspective, the employees didn't know that they weren't supposed to do certain things. Determine if you have any compliance requirements. Depending on what business your company is in, you may find that you're obligated to comply with something that either may limit or our ability to review activity, or it may put your company's compliance status at risk if you proceed. Check to make sure that what you're doing is achievable, and that the role of the employee is not potentially highly confidential information. And a review of that, confidential data does not compromise your company's good standing for any sort of compliance regulations. If your company deals with federally classified data, for example, and that employee had access to that, you may need to call in someone to do an investigation with the appropriate clearance to handle that data. Focus the scope of the investigation. We hear many times from our clients to find anything of relevance, and that's really challenging and not something that should be readily agreed to without first knowing the facts of the matter. Network and system logs will show general activity, and an in-depth forensic review of the systems and devices that the employee used could provide a very granular view of what they did. But if you were to start to look at everything that was done, that review could take weeks or months. And it could also take you down a path that really had nothing to do with the original request. So everything should be focused. There should be rationale for what you're looking at for that employee, and well-defined. You want to have a listing of the data the employee is suspected of removing, during what time period, and some common terms, perhaps phrases or language that information could contain. And knowing all of this will obviously speed up the investigation. We're always very cautious when dealing with legal counsel on these, that we're not going on a witch hunt and just trying to find everything out about that person. And obviously you need to check privacy laws and legislation. As we see, there's a lot of different privacy rules and legislation these days. And depending on the location of your company, you may have to consider those laws and legislations before starting any sort of investigation. Legislation is usually relevant to the location in which the work is being performed. For example, if you're asked to review a user activity for someone operating from regional offices, versus in Germany versus Toronto, Canadian privacy laws might not necessarily apply in Germany, obviously. So it's best to check not only with your HR department, but also your legal and compliance department before conducting any sort of review into employees' data. Okay, so what can be done? Know thyself is a term that's been around for a long time, and it certainly applies here. You have to start internally and talk to your technology teams, talk to your IT people. What technology is being used? Understand the devices and systems that are being issued to your employees. Is it a BYOD, a bring your own device, organization? That makes things a little bit more challenging, obviously, from an investigative standpoint. What controls are there in place? We've talked about that. What can a user do and not do within your organization? Where can they go and not go within your network? That's very important. We've seen cases before where obviously an employee has gone into a network area that they weren't supposed to be into. So that's great evidence. Again, we've talked about policies. Understand your retention policies when it comes to data. We've had cases before where they didn't retain certain log files, which can, again, make things a little bit challenging. So before you start digging into an activity, if there is an internal investigation, it's worth understanding these basics, as it may keep you focused. So I mentioned, developing that insider threat team, and this can be made up of people within your company or outside of your company. We often work in our little silos within our company, and we sometimes only get involved with other internal teams within our company when there's a need, when something's happened. There's been a breach in our systems, or there's some sort of IP theft investigation. What we're recommending is to be a little proactive and to form a working group within your organization, or maybe bring in others from outside, to help to mitigate this insider threat against your company's IP, to act quickly, right? If you're only reactive and talking to these different people we see here when something's happened, it's going to take you longer. But if you form this small working group and you have procedures in place to deal with some sort of breach or theft of IP, you can act a lot quicker. So as you can see here on the list, we recommend, obviously IT from your company, if that's internal or external. If you have a managed, security solution or a managed IT company, obviously get them involved. Any security, if you have internal security working for your company, we always recommend somebody from digital forensics side, internal or external. Any fraud investigators in your company as well. And obviously, as I've mentioned a few times now, HR and legal representatives as well is incredibly important. They will be the advisors on this. And obviously, we need to focus on the who, what, why, when, and how. Who has access to information? Who do we suspect is taking this data? What information do they have access to, and what avenues do they have access to that information? Why would they be taking company data with them? That's an important one to think of as well. When do we think that happened? Certain time frames. Again, we've, as I mentioned earlier, we've had investigations that have gone back. They say take a look at the last 3 years. Well, we can, but that's a lot of data to look through. So obviously, if you can narrow the time frame a little bit more, it's relevant. And then how do we think that they took that data? And in a lot of organizations, that's why what they're asking us to do. So looking at how digital forensics can help with that insider threat program, there are 3 main categories of how this can work. So there is data capture, there is a quick look during interviews, and then there is a deeper dive. So data capture. There's a quote from the 2016 Verizon report. Every year Verizon does a report on data breaches and data protection. And there's a quote in that says, love your employees, bond at the company retreat, bring in bagels on Friday, but monitor the heck out of their authorized daily activity, especially ones with access to data such as financial accounts, PII, payment cards, medical records, etc. So the question that we always say is, might you be missing anything by only, monitoring those activities? And we have some clients that will ask us to just acquire, preserve devices or network activity or whatnot at random times during the year. I mentioned earlier about being able to compare data over time, and some of our clients will bring us in at random times to just preserve that data. We then safeguard that or give the copies of that information to our clients. In that example I mentioned earlier where that C-suite employee had wiped their drive, if we had an image or a data capture of his drive prior to his departure, it would have dramatically changed the outcome of that matter. We wouldn't have been presented with a blank drive or a blank computer in front of us. We would have had actual data to look at. A quick look. Exit interviews are a great way to learn, why an employee is leaving a company and ways that company can improve. However, they can also be used to determine if an employee may have taken company IP with them. HR staff can ask questions to learn more about where the employee kept company data, did they take it home, on what devices, and when. And then while that interview is being conducted, and if warranted, digital forensic practitioners can discreetly do a very quick review on that employee's device in question, work issued laptop, to look for any indicators of IP theft. Is there any USB usage and files on, those USBs that, contain intellectual property theft, and maybe the company had a no USB policy or whatnot. And there are numerous companies that we know that have baked this into their exit interviews. While they're chatting with the person, they bring in somebody to do a very quick triage, so to speak, of the system, just to see if there's any quick information there. Obviously, if there is an investigation or things are found during that interview process, a deeper dive can be looked at, and this will obviously be longer in duration than the quick look during the interview process. But during the deep dive, you can recover deleted content, rebuild evidence, compare different artifacts over time or between people, paint the picture of what really happened, and obviously build that timeline, which is obviously very, very important. So where possible, we say, be proactive rather than reactive. And that is, great for companies to do. We see a lot of companies that, be it intellectual property theft, insider threats, or a breach, they're reacting for the most part. They're not preparing for this ahead of time, and especially when it comes to protecting your company's IP, we're challenging companies to be proactive. Develop those teams inside the company, put those policies and procedures in place. Promote these types of programs. Make programs like this part of the corporate culture. Tell your employees when you are hiring them, we take the protection of our company's data very seriously, and we put policies and procedures in place to make sure that doesn't happen. So tell people right up front that you're going to be, adapting the security, and there's acceptable use policies and other, policies out there, but be transparent, and let your employees know that their systems, are potentially being monitored, and the activity on those systems may be looked at a deeper level when they are leaving the company. And again, it's always important for employees to know this right from the very beginning. We've worked with some companies who tell their employees right at the hiring phase or right at the onboarding phase, all of the data protection steps that the company goes through. And then it's out there. It's transparent. Everybody knows about it. Nobody's hiding anything. And then if somebody does leave and their computer or their devices are looked at, it's not a shock to anybody. Right. So build that corporate culture of security, because right now what we see is, for the most part, most organizations rely on their IT department or their IT security department to protect the company, to protect it from external forces trying to come in, and also the internal forces. And what we're challenging the companies we work with to do is to change that mentality. It's not one person or one area of your organization's job to protect the entire company. We're trying to change the corporate culture to it's everybody's job at the company to protect the company, be it from external sources or internal sources as well. Okay, so once you've done that and you've created that corporate culture, it does make things a little bit easier to then develop some of these teams and develop some of these processes of looking at data. And especially the preservation of data for people that are accessing intellectual property or very sensitive information within your company. Preserving their data at random times during the year, it's not outside of the norm then if it's transparent, and nobody will be shocked by that happening. I think that is it. I'm going to hand the mic over now.
Thank you, Ryan, for this great presentation. I want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for computer forensics introduction, foundation, and lead forensics manager. A PCB certificate in this field will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing forensics processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now we will go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees. The first question is, what is the relationship between digital forensics and cyber forensics?
So digital forensics is obviously a portion of cyber forensics. Cyber forensics, for the most part, is more looking at networks, what's going on within a network environment. It can be anything from other sources out there. Cyber forensics in general can incorporate information that's out in the public realm on the web, within your network, within the logs of your systems, malware analysis or memory analysis. Digital forensics, for the most part, is somewhat more focused on more devices. So I would say, while it does incorporate, your network and whatnot, it also incorporates, the endpoints, the systems themselves, the computers or the mobile devices or whatnot.
Thank you, Ryan. Now another question is, where is digital forensics most effective? Embedded to internal security controls, proactive, or after the termination or resignation, reactive?
I think it's a little bit of both. As I was showing there in the slides, I think The most important part, I think, of digital forensics, at least from my perspective, is the preservation of data. You know, I come from a long law enforcement background, and preserving the evidence is obviously the most important step. So if you haven't preserved that data and the employee is terminated or resigns and they've wiped all that information, then you're one step behind the ball. So I think making sure that you're preserving the data in a proper manner is probably the most important step, and that's being proactive. There's another presentation that I do, and I show a slide at I don't remember which website, but it's a very common website out there, and it talks about, you know, when you're about to leave, when you're about to resign, here's the things that you should do, and one of them is how to wipe your system, wipe your computer. So it's not hard these days to do that, and there's lots of resources out there teaching people how to do that. So I think preserving the evidence along, during the time frame is important. But then, you know, obviously working, you know, the digital forensics component into your corporate culture and telling people, hey, when you're leaving, we want to talk to you about this. We want to talk to you about, you know, whether or not you had data on USB devices, and we're going to take a quick look at your computer to make sure that we don't see any evidence of that as well. So it's baking in the proactive and the reactive steps as well.
Thank you, Ryan. Another question from an attendee is, what are the standards of management systems which, when implemented, can decrease the risk of IP attacks?
Sorry, can you say that again? What are the standards of management?
Management systems which, when implemented, can decrease the risk of IP attacks.
IP attacks. Well, there's lots of different standards out there. When it comes to, you know, your internal architecture and things that you can do. You know, we touched a little bit in here at the very beginning about, you know, your security architecture and firewalls and other monitoring tools. So there's different. You know, NIST is a great organization to go and look at for different standards. And that will all help. Decrease different attacks on your IP, both from an external and internal perspective. When it comes to other standards, I always think that those policies and procedures and acceptable use policies that we mentioned earlier are incredibly important. We've had companies that have, you know, spent lots of money setting up, you know, perimeter controls and access controls within an environment. They've locked down USBs so they don't allow USB devices and whatnot, but then they didn't have any sort of acceptable use policy. So the employees, even though they were being monitored and tracked and restricted in a lot of ways, they were never told what they can and cannot do. So I think both of those sides need to be hand in hand. The employees can't be left in the dark. And I think that's where, you know, I was ending off this presentation saying, make this part of your corporate culture, make it transparent so everybody knows that everybody in that organization is helping to protect that company's data. So you have to have both.
Thank you, Ryan. Now, to add to that question, does digital forensics include protection of IP from cyber attacks?
Well, it can. Again, I mentioned, you know, cyber attacks, especially the external attacks. There are obviously tools out there that we look into the outputs of those tools when we're doing a investigation into a breach. Different log files or whatnot. Server logs or things like that. So some of those tools that companies use to stop those external breaches obviously have data that we look at from the digital forensic side of things. But I don't know if I would consider those tools themselves as a part of digital forensics.
Thank you, Ryan. Another question is, how can one determine if an internal staff is covertly performing cyber espionage or releasing sensitive information to a third party?
So how can you determine if somebody inside is covertly corporate espionage or, well, again, I think looking at the behaviors of somebody, we went over the behaviors that the FBI mentioned earlier. If you have systems in place that monitor, an employee's activity, your email monitoring or web traffic monitoring, or monitoring the transfer of files, of large data sets, and then combining that with the behaviors of that person. Again, are they sneaking around? Are they looking for, working weird hours? Are they doing things? May help you in determining if there's some sort of covert. For the most part, I don't know of many intellectual property theft cases that we've worked on where it's been overtly done. Nobody's staying out there saying, I'm gonna leave this company, I'm gonna take everything with me. It's almost always covertly done. So putting what we talked about today, some of those procedures in place, and again, preserving that data. We talked about, going in at random times during the year and preserving the data on some of those systems. You can do that quick analysis right then and there. You don't have to wait until the employee is leaving. We have other companies where we'll go in once or twice a year. We'll take a quick look at their systems of certain employees that have access to, intellectual property for that company, and we'll do that quick look right then and there on scene, before waiting till they leave.
Thank you, Ryan. Now, to add to that question, does a company have the right to forensically check employees' belongings to find evidences for a particular case?
So an employee's belongings, so this would be a bring your own device, I believe, question.
Yeah, I mean like smartphones, mobile devices, etc.
That gets a little bit more challenging, obviously, because there are privacy issues for that. A lot of companies will obviously, when somebody's bringing a device, they'll have rules and policies and how they can use those devices for company data, but a lot of don't. They just say, here, this is how you sign up for your email, and here you go, or to get into our access to our information. I think that is a question for a legal representative, obviously, within your jurisdiction, whether or not you need consent to look at that data, or some sort of judicial authorization to look at that data. But that's going to change depending on the jurisdiction that your company is in.
Thank you, Ryan. Because of the time limitation, we will only answer one more question. The last question is, in the DF techniques, where do you place continuous monitoring of access profile activities?
In the DF techniques, where do we place the continual monitoring of activities? Well, for the most part, those digital forensics are looking at a snapshot in time. So, we're not, digital forensic techniques usually aren't used for continual monitoring. We're either coming in at certain time frames to look at this snapshot in time, and then we can compare it to another snapshot in time. But for the most part, digital forensics is not a continual process. That gets a little bit more challenging, especially the tools that we use. The continual monitoring is more the different tools and systems that we talked about earlier. The email monitoring systems, or the web monitoring systems that are out there, or the transferring of files, things like that. That's more the continual monitoring. Whereas the digital forensics is looking, it's sort of an investigation as to what's happening right now on this system.
Thank you, Ryan, again for this great session, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website, as well as on our YouTube channel, together with the slides of the presentation. For more information, you can visit our website, www.pcb.com. Thank you all, and have a great day.